Okay, so I think we're up and going. Welcome, everybody. We're working with Pathwork Guide Lecture number 52. It was offered June 5th, 1959. Here comes Dick. And so I guess we could do also a little opening go around. If anybody, this is a lecture that many of us are familiar with and also may have reread and seen something new in it. So does anybody want to just offer something before we go into the lecture?
I've read this a few times because I have a stumbling block here with all images. I don't know if God image is particularly worse than the other images I have. Maybe it is. I've recently had some kind of better understandings of my relationship with my father, and I can really see how this my God image ties into this very fractured relationship that I have. As we go, I have lots of questions, so you don't mind I
Great.
stop you and okay,
Absolutely. Please.
great, thank you.
Anybody else want to chime in here before we start? Okay. So he says, "Greetings. I bring you blessings in the name of God. Blessed is this hour, my dearest friends. In the Bible, it is said that you should not create an image of God. Most people believe this statement means that you should not draw a picture or make a statue of God. But this is by no means the entire sense. If you think about this statement a little more deeply, you will come to the conclusion that this could not be all that is implied in this commandment. You must now perceive that this refers to the inner image. You are still so involved in your wrong conclusions and your irrational impressions that you are bound to have an inner image about God, as well as on all other subjects that are most important in your life. Right? So he's just saying, that until we're more conscious, we don't really recognize, but, almost everything in childhood, we created an image, which is basically an overgeneralization of reality, so sort of all men are, all women are, work is, money is, right? All of these big topics of life and others, like the self-image, and this can get very subtle as well in ways that we, are still recognizing. But, to recognize that we do have these sort of generalizations and projections on these aspects of life that color and the relationship and our way of responding, and being in that relationship. So uh, for us to make a real connection with God, it's important that we clarify, what the real God is, as opposed to the God image. And so he says we're involved in our own wrong conclusions, your irrational impressions, and so these create this inner image about God. And children experience, so it's all about authority, right? It's like, because God is this, what we're taught, and especially when we're young, is God is the greatest authority. It's the thing that usually, I mean, even some parents use God to scare their kids with, and stuff like that, to try to get compliance and that sort of thing. So children experience their first conflict with authority at an early age. And that's also because, we have, well, he talks about it. Let me read the lecture instead of speak to it. So he says, they learn that God is the highest authority. Therefore, it is not surprising that children project their subjective experiences with authority on their imaginings about God. An image is formed, and whatever the child's and later the adult's relationship to authority is, his or her attitude toward God will most probably be colored and influenced by it. Children experience all kinds of authority. When they are prohibited from doing what they enjoy most, they experience authority as hostile. When parental authority indulges a child, authority will be felt as benign. And when there is a predominance of one kind of authority in childhood, the reaction to that will become the unconscious attitude toward God. In many instances, however, children experience an admixture of both, and then the combination of these two kinds of authority form their image about God. To the degree a child experiences fear and frustration, to that same degree will fear and frustration unconsciously be felt toward God. God is then believed to be punishing and severe, often even unfair and unjust force that one has to contend with. I know, my friends, that you do not think so consciously, but in the pathwork you are asked to find the emotional reactions that do not correspond at all to your conscious concepts. The less the unconscious concept coincides with the conscious one, the greater is the shock when one realizes the discrepancy. Practically everything the child enjoys most is forbidden. Whatever gives most pleasure is prohibited, usually for the child's own welfare. This the child cannot understand. Parents may also prohibit pleasure out of their own ignorance and fear, and thus it is impressed on the child's mind that for everything most pleasurable in the world, one is subject to punishment from God, the highest and sternest authority. In addition, you're bound to encounter human injustice in the course of your life, in childhood as well as in adulthood. If these injustices are perpetrated by people who stand for authority and are therefore unconsciously associated with God, your unconscious beliefs in God's severe injustice is strengthened. Such experiments also intensify your fear of God. All this forms an image which makes, if properly analyzed, a monster out of God. This God, living in your unconscious mind, is really more of a Satan. So let me pause there. Anybody want to speak to anything?
I expect you'll get in a little bit into the religious aspect of God as well as the parental, right?
Right. Yeah, we'll continue in this lecture. Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
but it's interesting. This is very deep. And so it's like we don't even recognize. I mean, I was just, I think, like taking another dive into it a couple of years ago, where something happened to me that felt a little unjust, right? And it was very interesting to watch, and it was with outer authority, right? How all of this fear and this, like, what did I do wrong, God, kind of like unconscious stuff came up, and a feeling of, well, what was this about? And I mean, I think in the long run, I finally ended up feeling like, well, it was just about this to bring up all of my, unconscious God image stuff so I could look at it one more time and remember that it just wasn't true, right? And it all worked out in a way more grace-filled than I would have imagined. So, more or less reinforcing a benign reality of God rather than the fears that came up in the process. So most of the time, if we have some kind of shaking in life, it's when our God image will get activated in some way.
Yeah. Well, eventually I'm going to get into sin, punishment, retribution. All that's God stuff too, and that's being strict Catholic when I grew up. It's embedded in there. And
Yes, yes,
I'm aware of it, but it's like, whoa, it's still embedded in there.
right. So and it is, I mean, it's on our culture at large to some degree, right? That there is this sort of sin redemption theology. I mean, there are many great thinkers that are challenging this on all kinds of levels now. I like Richard Rohr, and I like Matthew Fox, and Brian Swim also was, raised Catholic, right? And came to this whole other place. But, more and more people are, seeing, and, you might like Richard Rohr because he kind of really blasts the church for this level of ignorance, right? And
Yeah, I read a little of his stuff. Yeah, he's right on.
yeah. And it's important in a way to see the truth, right? And to see sort of the cultural conditioning around it, because there is a lot that, we think is wrong with us, and it really is in the culture. But it's the same thing. We still have to wake up, right? We have to do exactly what he says with the images and discover what the truth is, and sort of re-educate the inner child, right? In that. So um and some people don't use the word God anymore because it has all of these connotations, right? That we have of um the churchianity and the stuff that we're not comfortable with. But I think in some ways, I mean, whatever word we use is totally fine, but I hate to, I'd like to rehabilitate the word God. It's like it was this thing that we projected up into the sky, the God up above, that was going to be the Father God. That's kind of the Jewish and also Catholic. And then, you have like the Divine Mother that's completely missing, except in, some Catholicism with Mary. But she's a kind of smaller image of the divine feminine that then is really accurate. So there's a lot of loss, right, in sort of the diminishment of the power of the truth in religion, right? That religion is supposed to be there to help us bind back to these great realities, and this religion, and in the West largely religion became a source of control, right? How do you control people? So it definitely has all kinds of authority in that church, dictates, and again the child internalizes them. And so that's the work, is we have to free ourselves from all of that. I think someplace the guide says, you have to examine every belief you've ever heard and decide whether you want to believe it, or if that's true or not, if that's what you want to believe. So, we all have to explore in this way. And then, it's sometimes, even though it, right, it's a process of transforming the fears of the child, the misconceptions and the images. So but I
Yeah,
think it's a beautiful work, because if we can, that as we go, that opens us more and more to the truth of the real God, right? And to the beauty of the connection, which is our birthright, right? The fact that we are missing that connection is a great hole in us, and so it's very important to try to heal the God image and connect with the real God.
I was God traumatized too by the Catholic Church when I was young.
Interesting. Yeah, I think Judy is. So we've got several of you. Yeah, and I was never in the Catholic Church, but and I was in a fairly liberal Protestant church, but I still picked it up. It's in the cultural airwaves. It's like in some way or another, probably not quite as badly as the Catholic imprint, but um, so he says you yourself have to find out in your work or yourself how much of everything holds true for you personally. Is your soul impregnated with particular or similar wrong concepts? It's kind of like he gives us some various ideas and examples, but the job is, these are the maps, and we have to go into our own inner territory and see what it is that we hold. So if and when a growing human being becomes conscious of such an impression, he or she often does not understand that this concept of God is false, and that God is not what is experienced in the psyche. Then the person turns away from God altogether, wanting no part of the monster discovered hovering in his or her mind. This, by the way, is often the true reason for someone's atheism. Hold on. Um, Welcome, Tamara. She's getting. Hello.
Hi.
Right. Welcome. So, he's talking here about, like you get to a certain level of consciousness, and I can remember this in my own growth, where I could no longer like align with, like the churchianity's God, especially if it was inconsistent or, punishing, I would read, like some of the Old Testament expressions of God, punishing people or whatever, being angry at us, and it didn't ever fit, particularly with my understanding of the message of Jesus, right? And I was raised within a context of that, which was saying that this message was love, right? So maybe that helped, but there was something in me that, realized, there's something off in in this way that we see God, right? And so that also helped me go on my own inner journey and search, what is God really? Or, is God really, somebody that cares, and what happens if we screw up and we do bad things, right? I think my soul came in with a great koan of, like what really is the price for messing up in another lifetime, right? Seems like that's, I don't know what I did, but it always feels like, yeah, I must have done something, because it feels like a deep question in my being, right? That I keep working through in this lifetime. So, these are deep questions that we need, our relationship to God, right? And that I think I've mentioned before, Ken Wilber's, first person, second person, and third person God. So there's a slightly different relationship with each of those, and they're slightly different, ways of experiencing and looking at this. But I think that we benefit from all three, and there's value in each of those. And so, um, that first person relationship is the God within, right? What the guide calls the higher self, or the inner spark, or the Holy Spirit. uh, well, in a way, it's like the Christ, the inner Christ, right? And then there's the I thou relationship, which I think we need as children of life, right? We all are young, small and young, and we're new on this planet even, right? And as souls, we're like children, and so we need a father and a mother in the divine levels, because it's appropriate, right, for the child to have the father and the mother, and also our guides, and all of the family and support that we have around us from the astral, and so we can be in relationship to these, as a human being, right, needing help and seeking support for our loved ones and for ourselves. And then there's the third person God, which is sort of the Holy Spirit, and the God that is in the whole history of things, the whole experience of everything that we're doing. And so God is in every moment of your life, and in everything that is coming. And he brings things, even the crises, but it's not because he's trying to punish you or anything like that. So I say he, personifying it a little bit, but in a way, it feels like there's an intelligence behind this, this movement of our histories and our experiences. Um, and sometimes it's, reflecting our own inner, dynamics and processes. But other times it's grace. Other times there's always this goodness of God coming to us, helping in our lives. And, without that, we would be truly lost. So I think it's good to have all three. And so, when we have this false image of God, as some kind of a punishing, moralizing, thing, and when we get to a certain level of consciousness, we have to break out of that. It's sort of like adolescence, right? And so you have to rebel against, that. And I think he has another lecture where he talks about the stage of atheism as being, an appropriate stage. Maybe it's in this one. I didn't get all the way through, and I also, my outlining didn't work. I've lost my mouse and keyboard, so we're limping through this a little bit. But
Both
so he's, go ahead. Mhm.
so both Dick and Frank said that they were traumatized by the church, and definitely me as well. But it's this, for me at least. I don't know if Dick and Frank want to talk to this as well. For me, it's like it's because the church was the authority, right? Church was the authority, and the authority says God is this, right? Fits in this box, and then therefore, you're shit, or you're not good enough, you're whatever. It's difficult to disentangle that idea of authority and God. And I know the lecture's speaking to that, but it's really muddled in my brain. In my brain, perhaps not my soul, or maybe both. I'm not sure.
You know, it's probably something that you really, brought in, and there's some, there's divinity and distortion, perhaps there, so, maybe you just need to explore a little more, like, what is this concept of God that's been imprinted inside of you, and what is your sense of, whether that makes sense or not, in all of its particulars. Does that seem useful at all?
It does, and perhaps even more so, what is my distortion around authority,
Uh-huh.
right? Yeah, so that may be a big piece of it as well.
Right. And that may, show up in some way as you also you work with that, or yeah, you could work with, like, again, directly through the childhood experiences and see the overlay, right? Of and the imprint of, how the father, or, can be also the mother, right? Like any authority in school, might have been the Catholic church or school authorities, right? So it kind of, they were all together probably to some degree. So you got a massive, you know, whole reality was that and nothing else, right? That's where it helps to go do some, mind altering substances so that you can break out of the limited concepts of the mind that we get imprinted with sometimes. Um,
I think you just sinned, darling, just so you know.
oh, okay. Yes, I just
The devil made
put
you
out a
sin.
temptation for everybody, right? So yeah, but I mean, there's a kind of way that we get, that we get the world looks like this. And it was, very much when Eva was channeling these lectures, she came in at the time where there was this kind of construct of the world that it was almost universal in our experience, right? And certainly in our families, and it was on television, it was in the, and there was just, this kind of, it wasn't as diverse, it wasn't, it was like this kind of one image of, the family and churchianity and stuff, and so I think we all, didn't have any other alternative, and really until the 60s kind of came in, and then depending on, where you were in that journey, whether you had a kind of initial awakening and breaking out of, that box of reality. And so, but, it's still ongoing, and we're still, I mean, look at, sort of in the third person God, with nature, what we did was we turned that into lumber and resources and board feet, and robbed it of any sentience or any value, like outside of its commercial value, right? And that gave us the right to go and rape and destroy and do whatever the heck we wanted to it. And, there's a way in which we're just now science, right? That was kind of like like the out picture, when we went into a scientific, but now science is uncovering all of
I
this new
couldn't agree more.
information about how sentient and how intelligent, all of these creatures are, and how even the trees are talking, so there's this new, breakthrough again in our limited, picture of what the world is, which is, also what God is, right? And that's, I think, what we're really trying to do now is realize that, yeah, God is within, it's immanent, right? It's not something far away up in the sky, that we have to please. It's like all here in the world and around us. So he goes here a little bit into, the different, types of authority and what happens to the child, um, and the different splits that kind of get created. So I'll go ahead and read through this. He says, let us examine the case in which a child experiences benign authority to a greater extent than fear. Did I skip something? I guess not. Um, Fear, and let us assume that overindulging and doting parents fulfill the child's every whim. They do not instill a sense of responsibility in the child, so he or she can get away with practically anything. The God image resulting from such a condition is, at first glance, closer to a truer concept of God: forgiving, good, loving, indulgent. This causes the personality to unconsciously think that one can get away with anything in the eyes of God, can cheat life, and avoid self responsibility. To begin with, such a child will know less fear, but since life cannot be cheated, one's own life plan cannot be cheated, this wrong attitude will produce conflicts, and therefore fear will be generated by a chain reaction of wrong thinking, feeling, and action. An inner confusion will arise since life, as it is in reality, does not correspond to the unconscious image and concept of an indulgent God. And this is what like the immature, what the guide would call the lower self or immature child consciousness is. We want God to be our slave, at our beck and call, and we want God to give us what we want when we want it, and we want God to, make it all perfect for us, and never have any pain or any, discomfort. And so, when there is that, we this conflict comes up, in terms of our image as well. And sometimes we do. I mean, I know I have some of both. My parents were good about, letting children be heard rather than just seen, right? And so, we were indulged somewhat in arguing back, or, sassing, or, fighting back in some way, and sometimes we got our way. and I think that was really good and healthy in a lot of ways. But I also have to watch in myself a tendency, to where, I want to take that to the limit and get my way, right? Sometimes, with in other situations inappropriately, right? So I have a very strong self-will that will go to battle, and sometimes in adult relationships, that's not the best thing. So the image does not only depend on the particular kind of predominant authority experienced in childhood, but also on the characteristics the entity has brought into this life. So, right, there's always a blend, right? And so we have these experiences, but we already have preconceived lenses that we're looking through, because basically what the guide is saying is we're incarnating already with these images. The images we're bringing in are unresolved, confusions and distortions from probably another life, that were already, within us for this incarnation. And so even mild experiences, he talks about this in terms of the soul dent, will activate, these beliefs and these lenses that we look through. Other factors also play a role. For instance, when hostile authority in the person of a domineering parent is the predominant factor, the atmosphere in the child's home is filled with fear of this parent. The other parent may be doting and permissive. Although this influence is outwardly weaker, it may have a much stronger inner impression on the soul, and the resulting image may reflect that. The same holds true in the opposite case. Although severity, injustice, and fear may have manifested as the weaker elements during childhood, the impression on the individual soul may be much stronger, thereby creating a more powerful image. So that makes sense. It's a little bit of a convoluted thing. But I think basically what he's saying is that you know we think like maybe the fear, the severity and injustice and the fear, was the strongest influence, but sometimes it's like on the weaker parent. So let's say maybe we rebel, or we have our own judgment. The stronger parent judges the weaker parent, and so we judge the weaker parent and refuse to be weak, right? And or maybe the stronger parent is so scary that we get lost in our fear, and we can't confront, or we can't bring our positive aggression to bear on anything. Both alternatives are to be looked for. Even if one appears to be stronger to begin with, the pampering and indulgent God image is not simply added to the monster image, but is often a reaction to and a compensation for the false concept. And so there are, people that they kind of, have this, want to believe in the fairy tale God, right? But it's a kind of reaction to the monster God, and somehow, it's like you have to face the monster God, and find some grounding in the Santa Claus God in some way, and find what's really the truth here. And so he says the personality may grapple between these two concepts, unconsciously trying to find out which is right, never winning the battle because both concepts are false. It is never just one kind of authority. It is very important, my friends, to find out what your God image is. This image is basic and determines all other attitudes, images, and patterns throughout life. And I think I feel like this is accurate, right? And always behind all the other images, the God image lurks, right? So when you're upset at whatever you are upset at, consider you might be having a fight with God as well. Or if you're afraid of whatever you're afraid of, consider that at the bottom line, you might be afraid of God in some way. So do not be deceived by your conscious convictions. Rather, try to examine and analyze your emotional reactions to authority, to your parents, to your fears and expectations. Out of these reactions, you will gradually discover what you feel about God rather than what you think. Your God image reflects the whole scale between the two opposite poles, from hopelessness and despair, believing that the universe is unjust, to self-indulgence, rejection of self-responsibility, and the expectation that God will indulge and pamper you. Now, the question arises how to dissolve such an image. How do you dissolve any image? Somebody wanting to speak? First, you have to become fully conscious of the wrong concept. And that is not as easily or quickly accomplished as it might seem. Although you may be aware of the image to some degree, you by no means recognize all its implications, effects, and influences on your personality.
Sorry, Darlene. Can I interrupt? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Can we go back to this paragraph just before this one? Okay, Here we go. Your God image reflects the whole scale between the two opposite poles. So that sentence to me sounds like your God image, so he could be speaking to everybody's God image.
Right.
Is every distortion possible? Is that what I'm
Well, in some ways, we want to look inside of ourselves for both sides of these, right? It's about this kind of tendency that we have to split, and like one side is the shadow, and one side is what we're conscious of. And so you might be more conscious of, one of the sides, and he's just saying, don't forget, probably they're in relationship, both sides, and so, and it also is probably true that we contain all of the distortions, you know, but it's kind of like in the search, I think it helps to, like discover what is it that you really do feel about God, and to see if you can find that whole scale within you and within your reaction, the way life unfolds, right?
Thank you. Makes sense.
So um he says, you may often be aware of an image, but you may not even be aware that it is false. And this is often true, that we're identified, with this the concept as we understand it, and it is, that we haven't had any challenge or questioning that, we might have a different way of looking at it. And he says, even in your intellectual perception, you are partly convinced that the image conclusion is correct. As long as this is so, you cannot free yourself from the enslaving chains of the false belief. So the second step is to set your intellectual ideas straight. It is most important to understand that the proper formation of an intellectual concept should never be superimposed on the still lingering emotional false concept. This would only cause suppression. On the other hand, you should not allow wrong conclusions and images rising to the surface due to the work that you have done so far make you believe that they are true. In a subtle way, this is sometimes the case. Realize that hitherto suppressed wrong concepts and ideas have to evolve clearly into consciousness. Nurse the awareness of them in your surface consciousness, but realize that they are false. Formulate the right concept, and then these two should be compared. You need constantly check how much you still deviate emotionally from the right intellectual concept. Do this quietly, without inner haste or anger at yourself that your emotions do not follow your thinking as quickly as you would like. Realize that your emotions need time to adjust while doing everything in your power to give them the opportunity to grow. This is best accomplished by constant observation and comparison of the right and the wrong concept. Observe also your resistance to change and growth. The lower self of the human personality is shrewd. Be wise to it. So, I don't know, like that feels to me like sort of a very important, description of the process there. And yet, it still may be a little obscure in some way, right? Because, it's like we have to bring to awareness, to consciousness, what belief it is that is active in us in the moment, right? And then we have to kind of question. This is, I like Byron Katie's work. She's kind of along these lines. She says, anything she believes, she always asks herself, these four questions about: is it true? Is it absolutely true? Do I absolutely know this? I can't remember. And what would it mean if it weren't true? Kind of thing. So she does this whole inquiry with exploring the truth of any belief that we have. And the guide is also, like asking us to, look in terms of spiritual law, and this, truth that he's bringing later on in this lecture. He speaks of the real God, right? And so in many of these lectures, he's bringing spiritual truth. And if it resonates inside of us, right, it's like it awakens the spiritual reality and understanding inside of us, right? And it is that then that we can use so well, to work with, uh, you know, these images. And so when we ask, we can tune in and look to the lectures, look to our own resonance with, what we understand and hear as the truth that he's speaking in the lectures. And over time, as you integrate more and more, that becomes easier and easier, right? So that, you are more aware when you're identified with an image, and then it's more easily, recognized where what's the truth is. And then a lot of the process of bringing the truth into the place where the child still believes in the old thing is a lot of what we do in my groups and personal work, which is this kind of healing of this inner child, because it's sort of traumatized by all of this, right? And so we can't just sort of bring in the truth and say, look, just here, take this, we have to somehow help it. And it never had, a friendly adult connection to try to explain the world and what was really going on, right? So sometimes I think of it that way, like the guide is our best friend in some sense, and bringing us these truths. And we didn't get our the instruction manual when we came here, right? And we didn't know what we were supposed to do or how to work. And so here he comes with this. And it is a recollection, it is a remembering, right? So usually when we hear this truth, there's something inside of us that recognizes it, and we may not fully understand it all at once, but that it keeps us delving into it. And as we do, we weave it together, we discover more and more how it all connects and how it is working in our lives. And then it becomes our living matrix, right? In as we do this work.
Arlene,
Uh-huh.
um, the word emotions has been used a couple times in those paragraphs. And emotions almost seem easy compared to the word I would use with the Catholic upbringing I got is programming, or brainwashing even. It's some of the pieces of it are extremely hard to, I'm aware of it. I have my own concept of God, and especially for me, yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think this is where, the emotions fit right in. Because so think of one of those, difficult concepts that you have of God that you kind of know now is not true, right? But now go feel the feeling with it. Go into your body and notice the sensation, the way the body responds in that reality. It's a sphere of reality that a part of you, thinks is real, right? And when it lives in that sphere, it lives a certain kind of consciousness and has a certain emotional reality as well, right? Can you sense that?
Well, yeah, that the word guilt comes up, as you
Okay.
mentioned.
So
And
so guilt, and that guilt, you have to examine that, right? It's like, and so there's this whole journey of, like feeling into the truth, feeling into the fear of the guilt, the guilt itself, and what's the source of the guilt, what's the belief that you have, about that, and seeing if you can then bringing truth speak to the child, right? You can't just do it at the intellectual level, it is at the feeling level. So once you've done the intellectual work, you have to bring it into the emotional, and bring that sort of, it's kind of like the good news, right? The new revelation that the child doesn't know, that you know at a deeper level. And if you've worked it in some way, the faith in that or the grounding in that is strong enough, right? More than anybody else, you're the only one that the child will listen to. And so maybe there's an issue where, so you need still more of a process around, the two beliefs, and an argument about which is true. But once you find the true concept, you can imprint, but it is imprinting into the child emotional state.
okay, can I continue a little bit with that?
Yes, sorry.
I'll kind of out myself here with my biggest issue, it seems like, from the Catholic Church is sexuality. And was so programmed that it was so mortal sin-ish over and over and over, that, and sexuality is a natural, experience for human beings. And so I have bounced between earlier in my life being overly sexual to the extreme, and that was a result of the guilt around sexuality. Now I'm at a place where I want healthy sexuality. I don't actually have a concept of healthy sexuality because to tell my kid, because it gets so trapped in the past, in all my past sexual experiences. It's like I don't know any other
Okay, so
way to
that's
be.
good. So you know that you're sort of trapped in the duality and don't have the higher self reality to offer, right? So that's a part of what your search is for, right? Let me offer something that maybe the guide, would offer, and I mean, sexuality is a very primary thing, and when we get kind of screwed up with that, it's very deep and strong in the sort of animal nature of us, but the thing that makes all of that different is to integrate the heart with it, right? And so we can feel, even when we integrate the heart with our sexuality, that it is no longer the dirty sinful thing that we were taught, but the heart has to be involved, right? And if we don't know how to connect the heart and the genitals, right, then there's a kind of still split that's being worked through.
Well, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to get through it this lifetime, but ironically, the lady I'm with is Joyce, she's got the same Catholic guilt in her, and my trip was to go over sex, and hers was just to the complete opposite, and we're both reacting to the exact same confusion around sexuality in Catholic upbringing.
So let go of all of that and just find the love, and then let the sexuality blossom from that.
Well, that's actually what we're trying to do. So it's interesting, though. It's confusing.
And even Masterson Johnson, very back in the 60s, said basically the same thing, right? When there's a lot of issues and stuff in the sexual relationship, like let go of the pressure on the sexual relationship and just establish the connection and let the rest flow from that. And there may be some other healing and work with the child that you can still do. I'm not saying that, but I think part of that is to find the grounding in the love, right? And then help share with the child to the extent that you can feel it inside of yourself, that it feels different, that it's not the same as what you were taught was sin, right? Which was, there is a kind of sin in sexuality just for lust, right? And the Catholic Church put all of these, okay, you have to be married, et cetera, like these were the outer forms to say, you have to control that lust, right? But in this day and age, it's like, I mean, there's all kinds of relationships, and I would say, okay, so we can't any longer say we have to have marriage, and marriage never was guaranteed that there was love, right? So now we have to go to the deeper spiritual reality of what unites and what brings that into the light.
Thanks.
So I mean,
yeah.
I think it's, I hear your despair about it, or your hopelessness, but I think it's definitely a workable issue. It is a deep one, but for me, like all of these things, one, take time. Two, when we finally, like get to the point of real frustration with it, it's probably right when we're close to, but we have to get out of our box around it. We keep telling ourselves the same story about it, right? And then we keep being, stuck. So, this is where I would say, there's just more work there that's available, and you can probably do some, have this longing if you and to explore, like, okay, so what does this guilt feel like? And what is that voice? Maybe there's actually a negative specialist that's attached to you, that comes every time you think about sex, and it's gonna, like think, yeah, let's rebel and have more sex, or, and then let's feel guilty about it, or whatever it does, right? It's like these things, they get, they're like thought forms that come to connect because we have similar propensities, and then they can literally, come and tempt us every time, into the darkness, into the pain body, into the, the guilt and the, frustration and the despair. So we have to become conscious that, these uh, thoughts, even though we are deeply programmed with them, are temptations and not truths, right? And begin to respond to them as temptations rather than truths.
That's a
Temptations
tricky one.
into feeling bad. Yeah.
I'm not sure how to respond to temptation. That's a tricky one.
Well, like if you think of the thought that makes you feel guilty about sexuality, right? If you think of it as a temptation, you say, get behind me, Satan, right? I'm not going to buy that. I don't believe that anymore, right? It's like you're just trying to make me feel bad, and I got it, and I'm not going to let you make me feel bad anymore. I don't buy it anymore. And if you can't, if you're not there yet, then that's that step to go. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's just an incredibly big challenge because it's trying to make me feel good, but good in the wrong way, So it's a
Well,
very,
that's the rebellion, though, against the authority, right? So the oversex stuff, yeah, like that, you have to look at. So, why am I, you know, where's that desire, that demand, that, forcing current come from inside of me? And, what does that want? And, so again, it's kind of like, that's just the lust, right? Without the love. And so without the heart connection. And so there's something in that, yeah, like wants to just be free to lust away, right? And so, just like welcome it. It's part of Rumi's guest house. Welcome it and learn more about it. Who is this guy in me that is so into lusting? Or what does it get? What's the pleasure? What's the negative pleasure? What's the defiance and the, rebellion around the church issues, all of that? Because the guide will say, you're gonna, all that's gonna be involved in this, right? And it is, like with our sexual fantasies, it's one of the hardest things, right? Oftentimes the life force in our early sexual experiences gets affected, and it, we the guide says we cannot moralize about it, right? So I don't know, Dick, if that's a part of it, but that would be sort of the first step again, is not, not to moralize about how it is, but seek to be curious and, you know, understanding somehow to know it more fully. And when we get imprinted like that, it is like a deep imprint. And so, it takes a deep re-imprinting of the truth that we have to keep, working at.
yeah, well, I'm working at it. It's just sometimes
It's a big one. It's a big
it
one.
is a
And
very
some
big one.
things we bring in for lifetimes, the guide says, right? It's not a guarantee that this lifetime we're going to get it. But it shouldn't be a helplessness or a hopelessness or a, automatic negation of that possibility, because that sounds like something else is going on, right?
Yeah, no, I'm in it. It's just a challenge.
Uh-huh.
I think it's also important to remember that it's only a part of your personality that's distorted. It's not your whole self.
Yeah.
So you can't say, well, this sexuality thing is really fucked up in me, so I'm completely fucked up. It's not true,
A good point, but I've isolated it pretty much, but still, but when it takes over, as I guess a lot of men know it really is powerful. It's amazing.
I would treat that as another being that possesses you.
Interesting.
Give it a name. Give it a name. Who is it? Don Juan, or like give it an identity, right? That's not you, and understand that sometimes it gets bored, or it gets hot, or it gets something, and it wants to take over, and it somehow does, right? It's like it knocks you unconscious and possesses you. And see if you can sort of like watch it from inside, because you're not completely gone, right? But if you start getting moralistic with yourself, you'll get in a battle, and it'll win. So just kind of like watch it, right? And notice, get very present, and ultimately to work with those pain bodies, like our presence has to get strong enough, right, to kind of wake up and choose something inside of this deep possession, right? And so that's a big thing to do. Absolutely. um and the thing that happens that will help you the most is practice of presence, right? And that means just noticing, watching, feeling what's happening inside, without judging, without reacting to you, but learning. And as we build that muscle of just staying present, instead of going up into our mind and wrestling with it, oh, and here's that problem again, and oh, am I good, am I bad, am I right, am I wrong, all of that stuff takes us out of presence. All right. So, yep. So let's go ahead and continue on. But that's it's a big one, and that's good. Thank you for sharing that, and hopefully that it's right in this lecture as well. Because we have all these conditionings around it, and maybe there's some usefulness to ask yourself, what does God really believe, or what does my God, what does the true God call the higher self to be present to that energy in you, and ask it for help and healing. So, yeah, and again, like so there's this way that we're working with how to dissolve the image, right? And then that's first becoming fully conscious of the wrong concept, right? And so, that could take a lot to bring that fully fleshed out, right? We get pieces, but there's often additional things in it. Okay, it says right there, aware of the image to some degree, but you don't always recognize all its implications. And then sometimes we are aware of the image, but we believe it's true. So maybe there is a part of you that still really does believe, that you know, whatever you believe, about it. So you have to kind of ask the truth again, from a larger, like it's where the mind has to transcend itself, right? So open to your higher self, open to your intuition, open to your rational, logic. Does that make sense, right? And ask, could you possibly even know that what you believe is true? Because usually the answer is no. We don't absolutely know anything, right? And that kind of cracks the cosmic egg a little bit, right? We have these cosmic eggs that we're living in, and so we want to at least have a question, have enough doubt, that it's no longer an absolute conviction inside of us about the image. And then the next step is to try to get conscious, what is the truth? And the guide is always telling us, ask for the truth, ask the truth. What is the truth about everything that we're feeling, noticing, reacting to? He says it's important to understand that the proper formation of an intellectual concept shouldn't be superimposed. So we get the truth, right? And it's not like we have to deny the other part of it, but we have to hold them side by side, both hand in hand, equal. So here's the truth, and here's the concept, the image, the belief that I have that, I'm wrong, or God's, a monster or whatever. And then, by constantly comparing these two, right? And, bringing them back and forth in dialogue sometimes too. They will naturally come into alignment. Otherwise, we would be sort of causing suppression. And he says, do this quietly without inner haste or anger at yourself, that your emotions do not follow your thinking. Realize that your emotions need time to adjust while doing everything in your power to give them the opportunity to grow. And this is best accomplished by constant observation and the comparison of the right and the wrong concept. Observe your resistance to change and growth, because that's got a whole truth in it, right? We have to, if we say no, we don't want to like slam that no. That no is like an important voice. The guide says it's our free will. It's the most important voice that we have, and we have an absolute right to say no. If we don't have that right, then God is the devil, right? So our God-given right to say no, but then we have to understand why not, right? What do you believe is going to happen, if you have to change, if you go into this movement of change and growth, right, that you're afraid of? What is your belief? So we have to keep surfacing all of these understandings and beliefs that we're carrying. So he says that the resisting emotions do not care whether the proper concept is obvious or not. In either case, they will find ways and means of trying to avoid a change of inner attitude. But as far as your intellectual understanding is concerned, you must differentiate between two kinds of concepts: those that are obvious if you think about them, and those requiring development from inside, inner enlightenment that has to be earned in order to formulate the proper concept, even in your intellect. When you pray, observe how sincerely you desire the answer. You may dutifully pray for the recognition of your misconceptions, but inside there is a part of you, and again, this is where we feel, right? There's something that is not really aligned, is not joining in that prayer, right? And then at least you know that you yourself obstruct the light and freedom, not God. And then you can begin exploring, arguing with that part in yourself that persists in being childish and unreasonable. So that's the re-education part. As far as the proper concept of God is concerned, this is certainly one of the most difficult awarenesses to come by, because it is the most precious. Whatever your image is in this respect, this is where you have to begin. If you are convinced of injustice, so that you cannot see even factually that this conviction is wrong, the remedy is in finding in your own life how you have caused happenings that seem entirely unjust. So oftentimes, we have this image that God is unjust, right? So he's being, but that's not everybody's image, or I mean, it's everybody has some degree of that image, but we have different images. It's not the only image. So just take a minute and tune in, what is the predominant God image? And again, remembering that we have like multiple ones probably, but what is your sense? Do you have an understanding of what your predominant God image is? Go ahead. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
speak to that from my pathwork experience, because I'm sort of like, in a way, have a reformed God image.
Uh-huh. Okay. So
know?
going back in the past, what it used to be then.
Yeah, in the past, well, of course, it was, imprinted that God was doling out punishment and favor, and that was the distortion for a long time. But then I got involved in pathwork, and I've done a lot of, you know, re-imaging, I guess, or whatever. Not that's probably not even an accurate, but I came upon a passage once that said God is truth. That's what the guide said. God is truth. And it's like, in an instant when I read that, I was like, you know what? That's all he needs to be. That's all God needs to be, is the truth. Because until we know what the truth is about any given particular thing that we are confused or puzzled about, then we really don't know the God part of it, I guess. So,
Exactly. And seeking truth is seeking God. Right? Yeah.
that's right. And so I sort of came to the conclusion, my pathwork conclusion or process was that if the God is the truth, then the Holy Spirit is the deliverer of the truth, because the Holy Spirit is who I can communicate with.
Uh-huh.
So I just ask for the truth and
Beautiful.
be delivered by the Holy Spirit. That's my new process
Uh-huh.
in this new pathwork, body that I
Right.
live in.
And it's like a beautiful then, sort of shift, it sounds like, in life, as a result of that, right? Seeing, this potential of always knowing truth by asking Holy Spirit, and at least seeking, as best and trusting that when you need to know, or somehow it comes, right? Or truth is revealed, and compared to sort of living in that, doling favors or punishments, right? It's
Yeah.
like a very different reality. So this is how, huge the shift can be around our God images in many ways. And there really is, I think, a fundamental truth that our relationship with God is our most primary, consciously or unconsciously, and therefore kind of a source of our joy and wonderment, or our suffering and our pain.
It also became apparent to me that all I ever really wanted to know was the truth.
Right? It's all we need.
I mean, even as a kid, all I ever really wanted to know was the truth. Just it's just that simple.
So I'm aware we were only on page 5 of 15, so and we've got only about 20 minutes to go. So let me see if we can get a little further in. Maybe we end up doing in 2 sections. I don't know. So, but I thank you. I mean, that was a great example, Frank. I don't know if anybody else had. I really feel like that's important to, have some examples. So if we can, open if anybody else had one that they want to share. So I'll go ahead and go on. So he's saying humans like to concentrate unduly on the apparent injustice that has happened to them. And there's a whole lecture on the pain of injustice, and it's a big one, right? But we do unduly focus on the apparent injustices, and they focus on how wrong others are. And this should and can be recognized. But try to find your part. And this is important. He says, it's not that we shouldn't recognize what others are, doing, and make that discernment, right? And recognize. And he even says in another place that more we know our own lower self and our own masks, the more we realize what other people are up to, right? It adds to our discernment. And we should know, and yet, it's not about judgment or blame, or you know anything like that. And always, if it's happening in our experience, right, there's something that is within us that is, it's there's a gift in that. Somehow God is reflecting something. We're being, awakened to something else, shown, like maybe we're even falling into a pain body again. But that in and of itself is how we're learning and growing to evolve beyond that. And so he says, if you make half the effort we usually make when finding others' faults to recognize your own, you will see the connection of your own law of cause and effect. This alone will set you free. It's part of that truth, right? And will show you that there is no injustice. You will see that it is not God, nor the fates, nor an unjust world order where you have to suffer the consequence of other people's shortcomings. But your ignorance, your fear, your pride, your egotism, that directly or indirectly cause that which seemed so far to come your way without your attracting it, right? I mean, oftentimes, why is this here? It just, it doesn't seem like we're consciously aware of it. And I don't know that I always can find how I exactly attracted it. But usually, if I ask the question, what's it bringing up in me? I can get to the point of seeing how come it's here, right? What the point of having it in my life is, if nothing else, right? Because there's something that is getting triggered that I need to see. It's bringing something into the light for me, right? And so, if nothing else, I can always find where it's that kind of a gift, and that some part of my higher self must have invited that, or created that, and maybe also my lower self had something to do with it, right? And then you can go in and find more of that as you go. So he says, find that hidden link, and you will come to see truth. You will realize that you are not ever a prey to circumstance, other people's imperfections, but really the master of your fate. You will deeply understand, not only in theory, but in practice, that everything happening to you is a direct or indirect result of your attitudes, deeds, thoughts, and emotions. As far as the latter are concerned, they are most powerful of all, and this is constantly overlooked, even by my friends who have learned and at times experienced this truth. Your own unconscious affects the unconscious of other persons. And this I've, see a lot, and I always, if I'm in a negative space, or if I feel some defense or some, charge in or forcing current in me, and somebody reacts, I never feel, like, they did the wrong thing, right? I always recognize, okay, so that was a tit for tat, I was coming at them, in some way, and so they reacted, right? So I'm gonna wipe that off as equal and try to de-escalate, right, rather than escalate. Um, so he says the truth is perhaps most relevant to the discovery of how you call forth all happenings in your life, good or bad, favorable or unfavorable. Once you experience this, you can dissolve your God image, whether you fear God because you believe in injustice or are afraid of being the prey of circumstances over which you have no control. Oftentimes our God images, we should surrender to God, right? And so maybe we even do from a mask level, but deep down inside, right? Like we really don't. We're afraid God might ask us to, go hang on a cross or do something, really hard that we don't want to do. And so there's a secret rebellion that we feel inside, right? Even though maybe we're trying to find a way to say yes, and there's this fear that God wants us to do something that is not really what we want. And so that's another way that we get all tangled up in God images. And he says, we're never this prey of circumstances, whether you reject self-responsibility and expect an indulgent, pampering God to fix your life, make decisions for you, take self-inflicted hardships from you. The realization of how you cause the effects of your life will dissolve either God image. This is one of the main breaking points. So does that make sense? If we can see how sort of this third person God of the events of time and effect in our lives, is, it's like from a more primitive consciousness, we just assume, God is inflicting, the rain washes out the crops, and we surrender to God. And the guide even says in one of the lectures that in some ways that's an easier surrender than when we get a little more conscious, right? And have to deal with self-responsibility, to just accept that it's all God given. But this is a level now that we're having to open into the self-responsibility and see that, God isn't doing this. God wants always the good for us, and always, the best for us, and has compassion, and is chasing after us and trying to help us from our own self-inflicted suffering. And it's the self-inflicted suffering that we have to recognize, because not even God can prevent that, right? It's like the only person that can stop that is our own self, and our own free will and our own choices. So, one of your handicaps is your guilt feelings, or rather, your wrong attitude toward guilt. To understand that, it might be advisable to reread my lecture on the subject of justified and unjustified guilt feelings and the proper attitude toward shortcomings. If your faults depress you so deeply that you are afraid to face them, then this wrong attitude has to be worked on first because it hinders you in coming out of your own vicious circle. The guiltier you feel about possible wrongs you may have to face, the more do you escape reality and thereby inflict harm on your soul. The proper and constructive attitude toward your own shortcomings is the key to the dissolution of this and all other vicious circles you might be caught in. Understand that none of your faults are committed out of malice or because you wish evil on other people. All faults, every kind of selfishness, is nothing but a misunderstanding and a wrong conclusion in itself. Your fear often makes you so paralyzed that your faculties cannot function properly. As a result, errors in judgment, action, and reaction on your part bring effects into your life which you no longer connect with the origin of your fear. As long as you shy away from facing your erroneous reactions because of a faulty attitude toward your shortcomings, you cannot find the breaking point, which alone will bring you the recognition that you are not a victim, that you have power over your life, that you are free, and that the laws of God are infinitely good, wise, loving, and safe. God's laws do not make a puppet out of you. They make you wholly free and independent. In order to help you find the proper concept of God, I will try to speak about him. But remember that all words can at best be only a small point to start with in cultivating your own inner recognition, right? It's like these ideas can help us, guide us to seek and to find the truth within because it is there. But without our own inner recognition, it's just another belief thing, right? So he says words are always insufficient. How much more so when it concerns God, who is unexplainable, who is all things, who cannot be limited into words. I was reading or there was a YouTube video I put out with Richard Rohr where he talks about, the unspoken name of God in the Bible, right? In the Hebrew Bible, they don't speak the name of God because how can you, speak that? It's beyond all speaking. And so they designate that being by these consonants that are the soft consonants of the breath. So he says, like Yahweh is an in breath and an out breath, right? And God is as close to us as our breath. So you might pretend or play with that, not pretend, but just play with this. But again, it goes back to this idea that God is unexplainable, unnameable. So how can your perception and capacity to understand suffice to sense the greatness of the Creator? Every smallest inner deviation and obstruction is a hindrance to understanding. We have to be concerned with the elimination of these hindrances step by step, stone by stone, for only then will you glimpse the light and sense the infinite bliss. One hindrance is that despite the teachings you have received from various sources, you still unconsciously think about God as a person who acts, chooses, decides, disposes arbitrarily and at will. On top of this, you superimpose the idea that this must be just. But even though you include the word justice, this idea is false. For God is. His laws are made once and for all and work automatically. Emotionally, you are somehow bound to a wrong concept and it stands in your way. As long as it is present, the real and true concept cannot fulfill your being. So in a way, this is, I think, more like third person God and first person God, right? So God is, among so many other things, life and life force. Think of this life force as you think of an electric current endowed with supreme intelligence. Think of like when I say call light, that's kind of what I mean, right? This electric current is there in you, around you, outside of yourself. It is up to you how you use it. And we can call it and we can direct it with our awareness, with our intention. So when we're feeling a pain in our body, we can go into it and breathe and call light there, right? And with the breath, we breathe it and there's a sense that light comes and sometimes releases, sometimes, deepens, and you travel and it's like there's a healing that's going on. And you can use electricity for constructive purposes, even for healing, or you can use it to kill. That does not make the electric current good or bad. You make it good or bad. This power current is one important aspect of God where it touches you most. This may lead you to think that God is entirely impersonal and therefore to be feared even more. It may contradict the idea of his infinite love. So neither is true. God, being all, is personal as well if he chooses to be. But his personal aspect has no bearing on the question we are now discussing and on one of the most important aspects of your personal life. His love is not only personal in God manifest, but also in his laws and in the being of the laws. The apparently impersonal love of the laws that are. Understand what is implied in the words that are. Show clearly in the fact that they are made in such a way as to lead you ultimately into light and bliss, no matter how much you deviate from them. And the more you deviate from them, the more you approach them through the misery the deviation inflicts. This misery will cause you to turn around at one point or another, some sooner, some later, but all must finally come to the point where they realize that they themselves determine their misery or bliss. This is the love in the law, as is the fact that deviation from it is the very medicine to cure the pain caused by the deviation, and therefore brings you closer to the aim. The love of the law, and therefore of God, is also contained in the fact that God lets you deviate if you wish, that you are made in his likeness, meaning that you are completely free to choose as you wish. You are not forced to live in bliss and light. You can if you wish. All this means the love of God. It is not easy to understand, but those of you who have difficulty in understanding will one day see the truth of these words. When you have difficulty in understanding the justice of the universe and the self-responsibility in your own life, do not think of God as he, although of course God can manifest as a person too, since he can do anything and is everything. Rather think of God as the great creative power at your disposal. Therefore, it is not God who is unjust, as your subconscious may believe, but it is your wrong use of the power current at your disposal. If you start from this premise and meditate on it, and if from now on you seek to find where and how you have ignorantly abused the power current in you, God will answer you. This I can promise. If you sincerely search for the answer, and if you have the courage to face it without the wrong kind of guilt feelings, and you should all be able to do that by now, you will come to understand cause and effect in your life. You will come to understand what led you to believe, perhaps unconsciously, but all the more powerfully, that God's world is cruel and unjust, a world in which you have no chance, in which you have to be afraid and hopeless, a universe where God's grace comes to a few chosen ones, but you were excluded. Only understand the law of cause and effect can free you of this fallacious view of God that distorts your soul and your life. I know you do not think all that, but many of you feel it deeply hidden in your subconscious. You try to find that part in you where you do feel that way, regardless of your simultaneous sincere love for God. Find out whether you fear God more than you love him. If you do, you can be sure this image of God exists in you and you are living in distortion and illusion, since all images are just that. Enumerate the injustices of your life, but do not examine the lives of others or general conditions, for there you cannot find the answer. Try to find where you have abused the power current and connect these instances with the injustices you complain about. If you cannot do so right away, I will help you, and further work will show the connections quite clearly, provided you truly desire the answers. You have no idea what this discovery will mean to you. The greater the resistance to it at first, the greater the victory. You have no inkling how free it will make you feel, how safe and secure. You will fully understand the marvel of the creation of these laws that let you, with the power current of life, do as you please in creating your own life. This will give you confidence and the deep absolute knowledge that you have nothing to fear. So, I still have quite a ways to go. So let's maybe consider doing this in a two-parter. Oh, the next is Q&As. So, okay, let me go ahead and finish the lecture and maybe read the blessing or the ending, and then I'll take a look at these Q&As and see if we want to go over them. So he says, there is a type of personality so negative in this respect, though perhaps only subconsciously, that he or she is deeply convinced of the futility of one's own life and the available life force can work only in a negative way. This may sound like a paradox, my friend, but it is not. Life force is energy. And in a personality problem of this type, the energy is used only negatively. This means, for instance, that the person becomes most alive in negative situations, in situations of fight, unrest, quarrel, and disharmony of any kind. Then something vibrates inwardly. Yet when everything goes smoothly, although a part of the personality may enjoy it, usually the conscious side, another part feels deflated and lifeless. This indicates that the distortion about God has progressed to a considerable degree. To a small degree, most people have this reaction at least occasionally. You know, we get bored with life, right? We want some juice. The juice is in the negative, right? Um, so examine whether you feel more alive in a negative situation and more dead in a quiet one. Your reactions will have a connection with your God image. So I'm just going to scroll through the Q&As now and see if he has a closing here. Yeah. So he says, my dearest friends, may the words I give you tonight bring light into your soul, into your life. Let them fill your heart. Let them be an instrument to liberate you from illusions, my dearest friends. I bless you, each one of you individually and as a whole. God's world is a wonderful world. There's only reason to rejoice on whatever plane you live, whatever illusion or hardship you temporarily endure. Let them be a medicine for you and grow strong and happy with whatever comes your way. Be blessed, be in peace, be in God. Okay. Any last statements or questions or comments?
That was great. Thank you very much. I like this idea of the power current and what I do with it and how I give it away. It's a lot to think about. Yeah.
there's a tremendous amount in this lecture, as all of them, and they all weave together. So, but yeah, good. Glad that it helped.
Thank you.
Darlene, do you
Great.
think,
Thanks so much, Darlene.
You're welcome, Jacob. Go ahead.
Have a good night.
Yeah.
do you think that when the guy talks about God's laws in this lecture, that they are actually the same spiritual laws that are outlined by yeah, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we went over those to some degree, right?
Yeah,
And you can see, I mean, it might be useful to go back and look at those since you've read this lecture and see if you can see how God's love is embedded in those, right?
Mhm.
And how through those, no matter how lost we are in consciousness, somehow we can find our way home. So, okay,
Thank you.
great. Thank you so much, everybody. Good
Night.
night. Night, Tamara. Good to see you.
It's nice to see you too. Good night, beautiful woman.
Night.
I can't even figure out how to hang up myself. So Lord love